For almost 100 years, there's been this one question that just won't go away, echoing from the dark, chilly waters of a Scottish lake. Is there really a monster living in Loch Ness? I mean, it's a legend that has totally captured the world's imagination, right? It's built on these super grainy photos, really dramatic eyewitness stories, and let's be honest, a deep down part of us that just wants to believe. But what's really going on behind the myth? Let's dive in and pull apart one of the most famous mysteries of all time.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll go all the way back to the very beginnings of the legend. Then, we'll jump into the era of so-called proof, the photos and films that made everybody believe. After that, we'll see what happened when science finally got involved, before we start deconstructing the whole myth, piece by piece. And finally, we'll get to what I think is the lake's true, and maybe even more interesting mystery.
Every great legend needs an epic setting, and our story starts in a place that feels like it was literally designed to hide a monster. But to get to the first chapter, we have to look way further back than those fuzzy photos from the 1930s. We're talking nearly 1,500 years ago.
To really get this legend, you first have to understand the loch itself. Loch Ness is, well, it's immense. It's 36 kilometers long, and it plunges over 200 meters deep in places. To put that in perspective, it holds more fresh water than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. Its water is famously dark, almost black, stained by peat from the surrounding hills. Visibility is practically zero, just a few feet down. It is, quite literally, the perfect hiding place.
Okay, so the oldest roots of this story go all the way back to 565 AD. There's this tale of an Irish monk, Saint Columba, who supposedly ran into a water beast in the River Ness, which flows out of the loch. For centuries, though, it was just a local folktale. But then, in the 1800s, the loch becomes a tourist spot and the stage is set. The real game changer, though, came in 1933, when a new road was built right along the shoreline. Suddenly, for the first time ever, people in cars had a perfect sweeping view of the water, and that's when the modern monster really began to surface.
So the 1930s just absolutely ignited a firestorm of proof. We're talking a whole series of sensational sightings, photos, and even films that took this local legend and blasted it onto the world stage. So let's take a look at the key pieces of evidence that convinced millions of people that a monster was real.
The spark, the very first one, came in May of 1933. A couple of local hotel owners, the Mackays, reported seeing this enormous, humped-backed animal churning through the water. But it was an encounter just a couple of months later that really poured gasoline on the fire. A couple, the Spicers, were driving along that brand new road when their day was interrupted by something extraordinary.
A sort of snail with a long neck. Those were George Spicer's actual words. I mean, can you imagine? He described this creature with a huge gray body crossing the road right in front of their car. He said it had no limbs he could see, and it moved in this weird, undulating way before it just disappeared into the bushes. Their story became a media sensation, and suddenly the floodgates were wide open.
But nothing, and I mean nothing, cemented this legend like this single, solitary image. It's known as the surgeon's photograph, taken by a well-respected London doctor, Robert Kenneth Wilson. It became the definitive portrait of Nessie. It showed this creature with a long, elegant neck and a small head. I mean, it was the spitting image of a prehistoric plesiosaur. For the next 60 years, this photo was considered the smoking gun.
And the proof didn't stop with still pictures, oh no. In 1960, an aeronautical engineer named Tim Dinsdale actually captured film footage. It shows a large, dark hump moving with purpose across the water, leaving this powerful wake behind it. The film was taken so seriously that Britain's Royal Air Force analyzed it, and the experts concluded it was probably an animate object. This was a huge deal.
So then, the search for evidence went high-tech. In the 1970s, an American inventor, Robert Rines, brought sonar and automated underwater cameras to the loch, and his expedition produced some of the most tantalizing images yet. There was this diamond-shaped object that looked a lot like a flipper, and another super grainy picture that got nicknamed the gargoyle head. For a little while there, it really seemed like science was finally closing in on Nessie.
So by the late 1980s, the legend had just gotten so massive that it demanded a real, definitive scientific investigation. And this led to the most ambitious, comprehensive, and technologically advanced hunt for Nessie ever attempted. It was called Operation Deep Scan. Just try to picture this. A fleet of 24 boats lined up like a giant curtain, stretching across the entire width of the loch. Every single boat was armed with sonar, creating this acoustic net that was designed to detect anything bigger than a salmon. Over 3 days, this fleet swept the entire 36-kilometer length of Loch Ness. Basically, there was nowhere to hide.
And the result of this massive, expensive effort? Well, it was inconclusive. They did register 3 pretty significant sonar contacts with an object much, much larger than any known fish in the loch, but they just couldn't identify what it was. So after the biggest search in history, there was still no definitive monster, but the mystery wasn't exactly put to bed either.
All right, so with no monster found, investigators started looking backwards. They began re-examining those famous pieces of evidence, and when they put them under a modern microscope, well, that's when the entire legend began to unravel, piece by piece.
So let's go back to that famous Spicer sighting. They described one single bizarre creature. But what if they were actually seeing several normal things at once? Their encounter happened right near a forest, where deer are super common. In low light, it's totally plausible that a line of deer crossing the road could just blur together, looking like one long, undulating body, especially to someone who might already have monster on the brain.
And now for the big one, the most famous photo of all. Turns out, the surgeon's photograph was a complete and total hoax. In 1993, a man named Christian Sperling confessed that his stepfather, a big game hunter, had orchestrated the whole thing for revenge after being publicly humiliated for faking Nessie footprints. And what did he use? A hippo's foot. So to get back, Sperling built the monster by sticking a plastic wood neck and head onto a toy submarine.
And what about the Dinsdale film, the one that military experts checked out? Well, it turns out the initial analysis had a critical flaw. See, Dinsdale had paused his camera to save film whenever the object went underwater. The original analysts didn't account for those gaps in time, which led them to calculate this impossibly fast speed. A later reanalysis showed the object was actually moving at the steady, predictable pace of a motorboat, a boat that a local was known to use in that exact area.
Even those scientific Ryan's photos just fell apart under scrutiny. That famous flipper picture? It was heavily enhanced to bring out the shape. The original was way more ambiguous. The gargoyle head was found to be a pretty close match for a known submerged tree stump. And it's very likely the camera rig simply hit the bottom, which was shallower than they thought, and snapped pictures of debris.
So if all the evidence just collapses, if the photos are fakes and the sightings are just misidentifications, what are we left with? Well, this leads us to the most fascinating question of all. Why is the legend so powerful? The real mystery isn't what's in the water, it's what's in our minds.
You have to know this word, pareidolia. It's basically our brain's tendency to find patterns, to see familiar shapes in totally random data. It's the reason we see a face on the moon, or animals in the clouds, and in the dark, peaty waters of Loch Ness. It's why we might see a monster's head in a floating log, or its humps in a series of waves.
Because here's the thing, the loch is far from empty. It's filled with things that, under the right conditions, can look very, very monstrous. You've got seals that wander in from the sea, swimming deer that look like strange shapes with just their heads and backs showing, and a huge eel or sturgeon can definitely give you a shock. You combine that with floating logs and weird waves, and you have all the ingredients you need for a monster sighting.
And the timing of those first modern sightings is just so crucial. In 1933, only a few weeks before the Spicers had their famous encounter, the movie King Kong was a global sensation. And the film had this dramatic scene with a plesiosaur-like creature rising out of a foggy swamp. This basically planted the image of a living prehistoric monster directly into the public's mind, priming an entire generation to see one in the wild.
And this experiment perfectly shows how our expectations can literally shape our reality. A longtime Loch Ness researcher named Adrian Shine did this really clever thing. He had visitors watch the water, and then he raised a simple wooden pole from the depths. When he asked them to draw what they saw, a shocking number of people added a head to the top of the pole. They weren't drawing what was there. They were drawing what they expected to see. They were drawing Nessie.
So in the end, the Loch Ness Monster tells us a lot less about a surviving dinosaur and a whole lot more about ourselves. It really speaks to our love of a great story, our desire for a little bit of mystery in a world that feels increasingly understood, and the incredible, incredible power of the human imagination to fill in the dark, empty spaces, both on a map and in our own minds.